Good evening, and thank you all for your patience as we were making sure our Zoom link and live stream was fully functional. So thank you. My name is Melinda Treadwell. I am privileged to serve as the president of Keene State College and honored to be with you here this evening. It's truly one of my great pleasures to be a part of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program here at Keene State, to work with the Cohen Center, and to have the privilege of being a participant in our lecture series like this evening's launch. Last year, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies throughout the year, and we're very, very proud several days ago to be able to announce that this decade is now launched with a very generous gift from Rick and Jan Cohen, launching the Cohen Institute here at Keene State College. This will be a very exciting expansion as we move through the coming weeks. You'll hear more about exciting new developments linked with the creation of the Cohen Institute here at Keene State, how the Institute will allow us to expand our research, our practice, and the scholarship that our faculty and students are able to lead across the world. Every year, the Cohen Center series hosts scholars, writers, and activists who help listeners remember and think about new ways where we can make relevance, remember the Holocaust, and teach through the relevance in our world today. And to introduce tonight's special guest, I welcome Dr. Kate Gibo, who is the director of the Cohen Center. Dr. Gibo joined us in July of 2022. She's trained as an anthropologist of religion with expertise in religion in the wake of mass atrocities. She holds a doctorate in religion from the Religion and Society, from the Harvard Divinity School. And her first major research project actually investigated memorialization and meaning-making in a post-9/11 New York City. Dr. Gibo grew up here in New Hampshire. We are so glad she chose to come home to be with us. Before arriving at Keene State College, however, she worked for 6 years at the University of San Diego, where she taught courses on the Holocaust and related topics in the Department of Religious Studies, and where she also coordinated the public-facing events, the research, and the programs of that great institution. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kate Gibo.
Thank you, President Treadwell, for the warm welcome to tonight's event. This evening, we begin an era of new names. As President Treadwell recently mentioned, we received a transformative gift that will allow us to elevate the Cohen Center to the status of an institute. So over the course of the next few years, the Institute will be launching new initiatives and opportunities geared toward having a greater impact on and off campus. So I join with the rest of the community here at Keene State in expressing how grateful we are for this opportunity. Additionally, as the President's welcome indicated, I also have a new name. Many of you knew me previously as Kate DeConnick. I got married over the summer, so you can now call me Kate Gibo, just for clarity. And I have the great honor of serving as the director of the now Cohen Institute. So I'm delighted to see all of you here tonight in person and via live stream for the 2024 Holocaust Memorial Lecture. Tonight's program is made possible in part due to an endowed gift that was established by Norma and Lester Cohen many years ago. Before we dive in, I'm just going to cover a few very quick logistics, and then we will get right into our program. So first, we're offering an e-program for this year's lecture. And those of you who are joining us in person, there was the QR code that we invited you to scan when you signed in. If you didn't scan that, or if you're in our virtual audience, we would invite you to access the program on the Cohen Center's homepage, where it's also posted as a link. I should note that all of the materials for tonight's event were finalized prior to our becoming an institute, so you're going to see our old branding for a little while longer. And we would also ask that those of you in the room with us tonight, please remember to silence your phones and your other devices if you haven't done so already. And for those of you with us also, photography and unauthorized video or other recordings are prohibited, just as a reminder tonight. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our featured guest for tonight's lecture. She's going to speak for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll conclude with a short conversation. In preparation for tonight's event, the Cohen Institute partnered with 6 different libraries and reading groups across New Hampshire, each of which read or is reading one of our speakers' co-authored books about her work at Treblinka. Our affiliated reading group submitted questions for the author, which we have curated into a list of short questions to guide our conversation with her tonight. So we won't be hosting an open Q&A with our audience tonight, but we do invite you, if you're in person, to stay after for our coffee reception for informal conversation time. And the Cohen Institute would like to thank New Hampshire Humanities for supporting this reading program through a mini community project grant in partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities. Without this grant, we would not have been able to provide books to our wonderful affiliated reading groups, so thank you. And our team at the Institute also wishes to thank all of the individuals who have volunteered their time and their talents to making tonight's event a reality. A list of those people can be found in the e-program as well. Okay, so let's move on to the main event. The title for this evening's lecture is From Treblinka and Trawniki, Forensic Archaeological Investigations at Sites of Nazi Persecution. Professor Caroline Sturdy Colls, our featured guest, is a professor of Holocaust archaeology and genocide investigation, as well as the director of the Center of Archaeology at the University of Huddersfield in the UK. Her expertise lies in the investigation of Holocaust landscapes and other sites of mass and interpersonal violence using forensic archaeological approaches. Since 2010, Professor Sturdy Colls has conducted the first archaeological investigations at Treblinka extermination and labor camps. And she recently completed her monograph, Finding Treblinka, Forensic and Archaeological Perspectives, which is due out in print with Cornell University Press in 2025. She has also supervised projects at more than 60 other Holocaust sites and is currently the principal investigator on the project Trawniki, Nexus of the Final Solution, which is funded by the Claims Conference. And a full list of her many, many accomplishments and accolades can be found in the program for tonight. There were way too many to list right now. So I would simply add that after meeting her at a special workshop at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum 2 summers ago, I was personally struck not only by the innovative interdisciplinary approach that she brings to her work, but also by the sensitivity and care that she brings to working at sites and among communities that have witnessed murder and mass violence. So I now ask that you join me in welcoming Professor Sturdy Colls to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good evening to everyone here in person at Keene State College and to all of you joining us online. I'd just like to start by thanking Keene State College, in particular the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, President Treadwell, Dr. Kate Jubo, and all of the staff at the Cohen Center for inviting me here today. Last summer, I had the privilege of being part of a workshop with Dr. Jubo at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I heard about the exceptional work being done by the Cohen Center with survivors, their families, and many other communities, and in particular their efforts to protect and archive objects connected to the Holocaust. So it's a real honor to be here, and I would also like to extend my thanks to Salem University as well, who've co-sponsored my visit, and I look forward to presenting there on Wednesday as well. Just to begin, I would like to start with this example. In the archives of the Ghetto Fighters' House in Israel, a blurry photograph exists of a pair of child's shoes lying on a wooden floor. Out of focus as this image may be, anybody reading the description that accompanies them would feel a sense of sadness and loss upon learning that these shoes belong to a child who was murdered during the Holocaust at Treblinka extermination camp, an SS-ran killing facility where between 800,000 and 1 million people were murdered, most of whom were Jews. Who this child was, of course, we do not know. Such were the nature of the killings at this camp that identifying the individuals who perished there, even when we have the things they left behind, has thus far been impossible. But what we do learn for the archival entry for the shoes, however, is that they were found at Treblinka by Dr. Adolf Berman during a visit that he made in January 1945, and that they were taken as evidence by him due to his belief that somehow they would incriminate those responsible for the killings. As Berman explained further at the Eichmann trial, where he presented them, the shoes were taken from, I quote, heaps of shoes, piles of shoes, and amongst them were tens of thousands of little shoes of children that sat, I quote, amongst the scattered skulls and bones that remained at the site. Berman's close relationship with Janusz Korczak, who was well known for accompanying the children under his care to the death camp where they all perished, may well have attracted him to this particular item, as opposed to the other personal belongings that he recorded were scattered across the terrain. However, more than this, Berman really believed that the murder of children, the spilling of the blood of innocents, needed to be emphasized as a demonstration of the Nazis' desire to wipe out the Jewish population of Europe, now and in the future. For Berman, when he took them, when he exhibited them at the Eichmann trial, and when he donated them to the ghetto fighter's house after moving to Israel, these precious shoes, as he described them, were not only traces of one life lost, but symbols of all the young people killed at Treblinka, and evidence that over 1 million of such little shoes scattered in all the fields of death could be found, he said, so easily. If we are to unpack this discovery, the proof value that Berman ascribed to the child's shoes is, of course, evident, an attribution now commonplace in the field of forensic science when objects found at crime scenes. But this approach was very novel at the time. In an age before complex analytical techniques emerged, a quick glance at the shoes, which Berman actually unwrapped from a piece of cloth and held up to the courtroom, was enough in the eyes of the prosecutors to illustrate the suffering of the missing and the murdered. However, those shoes were never entered into evidence. Instead, Berman carefully wrapped them and placed them in his briefcase before the subject of conversation moved away from Treblinka. Here we see just one partial object biography and how one item can transport us from the micro-history of, in this case, an anonymous individual, to the macro-history of the Jewish population of Europe. A personal belonging bestowed on a child by a parent becomes a momentary commodity to the perpetrators and then essentially trash, before being chosen as a symbol of Jewish suffering, a courtroom exhibit, an archival entry, and a museum piece. But of course we're left with questions. What happened to the other shoes of the victims from Treblinka and that remained in the landscape after the camp was abandoned? Why were these shoes still present when all the traces of this camp were reportedly erased? Why did the judges and prosecutors not attribute much importance to the shoes compared to Berman, who was a Holocaust survivor himself? And what else could we have learned from these shoes if their value had been recognized more widely at the time? There are no answers to those questions that are easy to convey, but I use this example here as an entry point into discussing the importance of objects, which for archaeologists in the present remain important evidence of Nazi atrocities. And at sites like Treblinka, where the Nazis sought to erase all of the traces of their crimes, they became vital sources in our efforts to reveal the experiences of the victims and the actions of the perpetrators. In addition to objects, as a forensic archaeologist, I'm also concerned with landscapes, crime scenes, and what they too can reveal about the experiences of those who encountered Treblinka and the various events and interactions that played out within and around these camps. Let us consider for a moment this aerial photograph of the execution site that existed to the south of the well-known extermination camp and the lesser-known labour camp that existed at Treblinka. Here, etched into the landscape, we can see so-called disturbances, as we call them, caused by the excavation of organised rows and scattered mass and individual graves. We see different types of vegetation that grow caused by the same events. And we see the relationships between the killing site and the labour camp, which forever altered the fields and the forest in the form of the pathways which formed when regularly inmates were moved from the camp to the execution site and onward to their places of burial. We'll return to this image shortly, But I use it here to illustrate the fact that although landscapes may have changed considerably since the period when they were in operation, the alterations caused by mass violence such as the Holocaust are often significant. And as the work of archaeologists have shown in many contexts, these traces will be detectable decades and even thousands of years after crimes took place. And therefore, archaeological investigations of Holocaust sites have the potential to uncover surface and buried evidence that may not have previously been detected or which may previously have been overlooked. But I want to just backtrack slightly before we discuss the methodology and the results of the forensic archaeological investigations that I've undertaken at Treblinka to say a little more about the history of the camp. I'll keep this brief in the interest of time, but also because I know that Tom kindly provided an overview of the history of the site on his lecture on September 18th. So first of all then, Treblinka Extermination Camp was one of 3 Operation Reinhard death camps located in Nazi-occupied Poland. It was situated northeast of Warsaw, and the camp initially received Jews and a much smaller number of non-Jewish Poles from the general government. But later, Jews and a small number of Roma were also sent from elsewhere in Poland and from various other European countries. The extermination camp was built in April 1942 and began to receive regular transports from July 23rd of the same year. Those on the transports were swiftly taken to the gas chambers where they were killed, having first been made to hand over their personal effects on the promise that they would see them return to them after they'd been to the banya, or the bathhouse. In reality, these people were killed, usually within 15 to 20 minutes of arrival, and then they were buried in a mass grave or later cremated on makeshift cremation pyres. It's important to say that there were no permanent accommodation buildings at Treblinka, excepting for a small number of Sonderkommando Jews, because no one was intended to survive here. The camp functioned until November 1943, although the majority of transports ceased in August following a revolt by the Sonderkommando. Prior to the closure of the camp, therefore, the Nazis sought to hide all traces of their crimes by exhuming the victims and burning them. And once the decision was taken to cease the transports, the camp buildings were knocked down and the ground was levelled. Therefore, if you were to visit the site today, you will see a memorial that was built there in the 1960s, and the landscape contains few obvious traces of the crimes that were perpetrated. But the killings at Treblinka began much earlier, shortly after the construction of a labour camp adjacent to a sand and gravel quarry. Here, around 10,000 people are thought to have died, either through ill treatment or executions in the camp, or because they were killed at the execution and burial site already mentioned that existed 500 metres to the south. The constraints of time mean I won't be able to speak about all of these elements in immense detail, but I do want to point out here that the labour camp itself was an incredibly brutal camp for Jews and non-Jews, where guards deployed a wide range of killing methods such as beatings, torture, shootings and bodily mutilation, a fact that is often overlooked in light of the heinous crimes committed at the extermination camp. It's important to understand that from its origins as well, Treblinka was strategically situated on a major rail network and close to a major highway, both of which went from Warsaw and onwards to the east, as the Nazis said, where deportees to the extermination camp were told that they were being sent to work. Thus, the landscape here was intrinsic to the success in the eyes of the Nazis of the killing processes. And it's fair to say that what we commonly know about Treblinka extermination camp, and Treblinka more generally actually relates to the second period of the camp's operations after October 1942, when the camp was governed by Franz Stangl and when some of these photographs were taken by his deputy. Thus, the full extent of Treblinka's landscape, the physical evidence contained within it, and the events that unfolded there are generally still poorly understood. So when I began my work at Treblinka, I faced a number of challenges. There were gaps, first of all, in witness testimonies. There were only partial aerial photographs of the site, almost all of which existed after the camp had already closed down. Many of the maps that survivors drew, although absolutely invaluable, were considered to be 100% accurate, even though they were actually the wrong shape, the wrong size, had buildings in different areas. And so this presented many challenges as an archaeologist trying to reconstruct how the site may have looked. And so I initiated the Finding Treblinka project over 17 years ago, and I had many questions which, from a historical, archaeological and forensic perspective, I hope to answer. These questions do form the basis of my forthcoming book, Finding Treblinka, which has already been mentioned. So these questions included: where had the gas chambers been located? Where was the lazaret, the camp, so-called fake camp hospital? And where were the other camp structures within the extermination camp? And could their form and location reveal anything further about how the camp functioned? Where are the gas chambers? Where had the people, the objects that people left behind been located? And what could these traces reveal about the lives of the victims, both before the Holocaust and during their time in the camps? What could the architecture of the labour camp reveal about how it functions and the experiences of those housed within it? And importantly, had all of the mass graves at these sites been found? And what were the relationships between the execution site, labour camp and extermination facility? And of course, had the Nazis really destroyed all evidence of their crimes, as so it is often cited in historical sources? But I also faced a number of ethical challenges as well. The largest one being reconciling the fact that archaeology is traditionally based on excavation, with the fact that Jewish law, halakha, forbids the disturbance of human remains buried in a grave. Hence, traditional forms of archaeology, excavation, were at odds with the investigation of these landscapes. Further challenges presented themselves in the form of different opinions that are often held by different victims and survivor groups with regards to death and burial, particularly at sites like Treblinka, where Jews, Christians, atheists, and people from other faiths were all murdered and buried together. And the fact that archaeology is usually seen as destructive can be seen as being at odds with the need to maintain the integrity of evidence, much of which may be seen as sacred or cemetery-like by many individuals, regardless of their religious background. And so these were all challenges that I worked really hard with my team to address when I began researching Treblinka in 2007. Over the course of this project, which continues to date, I developed and employed an interdisciplinary approach that pioneered the use of non-invasive methods for the study of the Holocaust. During the fieldwork seasons that I undertook in 2010, 2013, 2017 and 2019 in particular, I worked very closely with religious authorities and museum professionals to ensure that the ethical issues connected to my research were not only accommodated, but they were front and centre of the methodology that I employed. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of that methodology here, and I can answer any questions that you have about these techniques in more detail afterwards. But the first stage of this methodology always begins with archival research. My team and I are also historians, and therefore we use documents, photographs, maps, aerial photographs, forensic reports, and legal proceedings to analyse and better understand the people, places, and events connected to Treblinka, and identify what physical traces may have been created, adapted, and left in the landscape. We also undertook oral history research, utilising audio, video, and written testimonies, alongside undertaking primary interviews and consultation with a wide range of survivors, their families, and experts such as aerial reconnaissance specialists and fellow historians. And in the field, we drew on a wide range of methods in order to examine as wide a range of evidence as possible. The examination of existing satellite data was complemented by the collection of other topographic data derived from methods such as LiDAR, GPS survey, total station survey, and terrestrial and close contact laser scanning, all of which I'll return to later. But in short, these techniques allowed us to map whole landscapes, find surface and buried evidence, and to examine micro-level traces such as objects and vegetation change. Moving further beneath the ground, we used a suite of techniques known as geophysical survey to search for so-called anomalies beneath the ground, which may indicate the presence of building foundations and walls, infrastructure, and mass and individual graves. And because we were able to use these non-invasive methods to locate suspected mass graves in the first phase of our investigation, I'm very honoured that at the extermination camp we were given permission to conduct minimally invasive excavations at the sites where we suspected the remnants of the so-called old and new gas chambers existed, in the SS living camp area and in the camp's waste pit. So we located all of these sites using non-invasive methods for the first time, and then used minimally invasive excavation to confirm our findings. This work also required us then to interpret the buried features we found and to analyse objects. We undertook extensive data visualisation and integration, comparing all of these sources to validate our findings, layering aerial photographs, maps, plans, and other survey data in specialist software. And as we will see later, we also focused considerable efforts on the exhibition and dissemination of our results, due to our firm belief that this work has much wider significance than simply being discussed in academic contexts. Indeed, my team and I are motivated by a strong desire for justice for the victims and a desire to tell their stories when they cannot. And also a desire to provide information to families who in many cases have waited decades to know what happened to their loved ones. Given the time available, I'd like to focus on 3 areas where this work's made a contribution to new knowledge about Treblinka, before speaking briefly about Trawniki. As I've spoken extensively about the fieldwork findings elsewhere, I'm going to keep this first part relatively brief, and I'd like to spend more time on discussing some of the new approaches that I've developed. But it would be completely remiss not to mention some of the very important discoveries that we were able to make. Firstly, the work has facilitated new spatial and material understandings at Treblinka. We were able to answer at least partially the key questions I presented earlier. We located the actual boundaries for the first time of the labour and extermination camps, which remarkably were unknown, and found the locations of key structures and killing sites within them. So, for example, at the extermination camp, we were able to identify the so-called lazaret. This was a fake field hospital where elderly and children were regularly shot into an ever-burning pit shortly after they arrived from the trains. And as we'll see shortly, we were also able to locate both the old and new gas chambers. At the labour camp, we were able to find the remains of almost all camp buildings, creating the very first plan of this camp, and illustrating how the structures in which the camp inmates had lived had affected their chances of survival. And at both camps, we located unmarked mass graves. At the extermination camp, these were confined to 3 distinct areas, which were illustrative of the SS's evolving killing practices over the approximately 15 to 16 months when the camp was in operation, and the increased need for burial pits as the number of killings increased. So earlier mass graves, for example, were located much closer to the railway platform. You can see these areas in blue here. And as the killings continued and expanded, mass graves were required at the rear of the camp. We also found a range of material culture connected to the camps and the killing sites, some during our excavations, some just lying on the surface, and some already in archives around the world as a result of post-war search efforts like those of Dr. Berman, who focused in my opening slide. And we were able to create object biographies and through these learn about the people who were sent to the camps. One of the techniques that we used that I think was really a revelation for us was a method called LIDAR. And this work at Treblinka, where we deployed LIDAR, was the first survey of this kind at Treblinka, but also the first use of LIDAR at a Holocaust site. And I think it's fair to say that it's really revolutionized the subfield of Holocaust archaeology. It works by emitting lasers from a device mounted to an aircraft or a drone. And it measures the distance and the time taken for those lasers to travel to the ground and be received again by the receiver. And what this does is it creates a digital terrain model, a 3D model of the landscape. But what it also does is it allows you to map vegetation that exists and digitally strip that vegetation away. So Treblinka is actually covered in trees, but what you see here is a bare earth model with those trees removed. And when this takes place, suddenly we can see depressions, areas where the ground has changed as a result of buried remains being present underneath. And so one notable example can be seen here, where there is a notable depression just here. And this was actually caused by the presence of structural remains of the first so-called old gas chambers at Treblinka. And we also used a technique called ground-penetrating radar to scan the ground, and doing so allowed us to confirm the presence of what was likely a foundation measuring 22 by 15 meters. As I said, we were then given permission to do confirmatory excavations at this location, and we subsequently found bricks, tiles, mortar, other building remnants, and the partial foundations of what we believe to have been this structure. It's important to say that the gas chambers were the only buildings in the death camp built of brick. They were the only buildings at Treblinka that were intended to be at least semi-permanent. And these structures, this building comprised of 3 gas chambers and facilitated the murder of more than 300,000 people in the first 5 weeks of Treblinka extermination camp's existence alone, and many tens of thousands more thereafter. And we were also able to locate nearby what we believe to be the new gas chambers, although our excavations confirmed that the efforts to destroy this building, which is believed to have contained up to 10 chambers, were far more extensive than the earlier, smaller structure. And as at the old gas chambers, the tiles we located during these excavations were also consistent with those described by witnesses. They were orange, yellow, terracotta in colour, and gave the structure an internal appearance of a bathhouse. According to witnesses, this structure and the new gas chambers that were built adjacent to it were intended even to replicate a Jewish bathhouse or mikveh, and their architecture appears to have been deliberately designed as such. And during the excavations in the area of the gas chambers, we also located many personal belongings of the victims, and this challenged many of the official narratives concerning the camp. Firstly, the narratives state that victims all had their personal belongings taken from them in the reception camp area, so it was somewhat a surprise to actually find them in this part of the camp. And many of these items of jewellery belonged to women who seem to have managed to avoid having them confiscated in the reception area. Perhaps these items had sentimental value and they smuggled them into the death camp. We also found a number of hair clips that witnesses' testimonies suggest may have found their way into the gas chamber area when the Nazis were forced to cut women's hair in the gas chambers instead of in the reception area because of the fact that they actually sent too many transports to the camp than they could handle. So they were forced to change their practices. And actually one thing that really emerged in my research is that Treblinka is often thought of as a killing machine. In fact, it was incredibly chaotic and at times completely inefficient. And I think that's probably what makes this site so terrifying, in that it was actually so primitive and so ineffective in terms of what it was intended to be, yet so many people were murdered. And like the fragments of unburnt human remains we found among the rubble, these items illustrate the complexity and variation in killing practices employed at Treblinka, and they remind us of the many nameless individuals who suffered at the camp and who comprised the unimaginable number of victims. And in total, even though we only did very, very small-scale excavations, some of our trenches were only 1 metre by 1 metre, we were able to recover more than 2,000 items near the gas chambers and in the camp's waste pit. And this again illustrated that a vast amount of items still exist beneath the surface, and clearly illustrated that not all of the victims' belongings were actually taken from them. I want to return to the image that I showed you at the beginning here to show again some of the other findings we were able to do thanks to the non-invasive methods that we employed. When we delve deeper into this image and make comparisons with witness testimonies and post-war forensics reports, it's possible to identify many different burial areas across this landscape, dating to executions and deaths that took place from the summer of 1941 until August 1944. So in parallel to the extermination camp's existence, mass shootings were still being carried out at Treblinka. We can see here a central corridor of mass graves and rows of mass graves in and beyond the forest, just here. The majority of which were highly visible and were actually noted by post-war investigators. Away from the main area, though, additional potential mass graves are visible, which were not knowingly found in the 1940s, and that's in this area here. And there are also some individual burials on the roadside. Some of these graves belong to the inmates of the labour camp, but as my archival research has shown, this site was also used as an execution site for inmates from prisons in the Warsaw Ghetto, who never encountered either of the Treblinka camps, but rather were sent directly to the site for execution. And here we can see this LiDAR plan again, where we can see just how forested this execution site is. It's totally enshrined in forest. But when we remove the vegetation layer, not only do probable graves visible in the aerial photographs become visible, but so too do many other possible graves that are or were in the forest. So the most obvious examples being here, but also in this area as well, and to the south. Many of these, what we now believe to be mass graves, are not included in the current memorial protection zone. They were not marked when the memorial was built here in the 1960s. And at this site, we were permitted to do some small-scale confirmatory excavations at 3 of these mass graves, with the full support of the Chief Rabbi of Poland and the museum authorities, on the basis of the fact that we knew that both Jews and non-Jews may well be buried at this site, and it was impossible to determine the locations of these graves conclusively. Given the dense forest, we were unable to use many of our traditional techniques. So these excavations were very minimal, just removing the top surface layer to witness some of the remains therein. And these remains show considerable blunt force and sharp force trauma consistent with witness testimonies that speak to the immense brutality of the crimes committed at this site. And further excavations were also carried out by the Institute for National Remembrance in Poland. They did a full-scale exhumation of a grave here in 2009 and similarly found more evidence of those terrible atrocities that were committed. And this leads me on to the second slide here that I want to show you, which really just shows you the sheer scale of the crimes perpetrated at Treblinka. So each one of these anomalies, we know for sure that the areas in blue are definitely already marked as mass graves and were found in the 1940s. The 3 areas here were new discoveries by us, and we also found traces in this area. But potentially every single one of these is a grave of multiple victims of killings at Treblinka that happened outside of the extermination camp area. And that brings me on to the next point that I would like to make, that there were forensic investigations that were carried out at Treblinka in the aftermath of the crimes being abandoned from 1944 until 1948, in fact, by the Soviets and Polish agencies. And the evidence of that my team and I were able to identify was either often overlooked by these investigations, or it was found by them only to be later forgotten or deliberately hidden. And of course, it's important to note that forensic archaeological methods that we have available today far outweigh those which existed at the time, and it's easy to be critical on reflection. But my research has shown that looting, anti-Semitism, a lack of understanding concerning the value of certain traces, a lack of time and resource, and the actual and perceived efforts by the Nazis to hide their crimes all influenced attitudes towards the physical evidence at Treblinka and led to much of it being overlooked. And I'm going to give you one brief insight into this here with a collection of objects that I discuss in my book that were found by post-war investigators working for the Central Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Poland to show how the perceived value of objects shifted over time, and in this case relegated important stories of the owner of these objects into oblivion. So some of the objects that you can see here were in a series of files labelled as pertaining to the investigation conducted by the Polish military mission for the investigation of war crimes in Germany. And it's a collection of items about Treblinka II, which were entered into evidence by a judge from the Central Commission in January 1946. They were items that he excavated in November 1945, most likely in the vicinity of the fake field hospital, the lazaret that I mentioned, and the waste pit, although he doesn't explicitly state this in the documentation. But certainly these items were found during those searches of the landscape. It should be noted that this group of items was clearly very small in relation to how many objects existed on the surface at the time. We have many photos that shows that Treblinka was literally littered with objects belonging to victims, owned by the perpetrators, and also the human remains of the victims as well. However, these items were carefully curated, we can see, to inform the Polish government in exile in London of the crimes that had taken place. So I'm just going to choose a few notable examples, one of which is marked A here in the slide. We had 2 penalty notices in this collection issued by the Council of Elders, of Jewish Elders in Sohedniov in Poland. And these notices retain the names Abek Viniaj and Aaron Viniaj, and warned of the unfortunate consequences these individuals would face if they failed to pay a fine to the German authorities. And further research by my team and I revealed that Abek Viniaj was most likely born on July the 2nd, 1926 in Kielce, to parents Masha and Aron, and that his family spent 15 months in the Sohedniov ghetto between April 1941 and September 1942. As the date on the penalty notice and the crime that Abek was perceived to have permitted are now missing or obscured, it's unclear at what point in this period he was reprimanded, and it's not possible to deduce whether this infraction resulted in him being sent to Treblinka extermination camp. However, it's notable that the receipt on the bottom of the penalty notice, you can perhaps just make out a line where you would tear this receipt off, is still intact, suggesting that he did not pay his fine, unlike his father, whose notice dated May 30th, 1942, had the bottom torn off. But we do know that on September the 22nd, 1942, both men were sent along with around 3,000 fellow Jews and 8 other members of their family from the Sohedniov ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp. And so these are the only traces that remain of those individuals, yet they've been locked in an archive for decades. We have many other documents in this collection that reveal the names of their owners. Chaya Leah Lev, for example, in relation to a number of correspondence in connection with the United States. A letter dated June the 23rd, 1939 from the American consulate in Warsaw to Lev at an address in Jezioro, Grodno, outlining that her application for a visa was not yet sufficient. Similarly, a Soviet passport issued in the Belarusian SSR belonged to a housewife, Sarah Necker-Grinberg, who was also found in this collection. We don't know for sure that these 2 women died in Treblinka, but certainly these items found their way there. And as well as these names, the materiality of the documents in this collection reveals additional important information about objects' biographies and practices in the extermination camp. So consistent with survivor testimonies, for example, we have documents like this so-called Kennkarte, a Jewish identity card issued in Germany, and police registration documents where the photographs were missing, that they would have been torn away, and a shadow of the image's former location is all that remains visible. In both cases, and many other documents, the names and personal details were also obscured, and witness testimonies suggest that this was a common practice where Sonderkommando were forced to erase the identity of victims from their documents. However, in this case, we don't know for sure that that's what happened. Perhaps environmental factors meant that they were no longer visible, or the degradation of the objects in the archive, because those things were not documented by forensic investigators at the time. There was also a small book in Hebrew in this collection, which was open on a Shabbat morning liturgy. And the book, I found out with the assistance of a fellow colleague, Barbara Mann, was distributed in mourning settings. Whether its owner expected to or had lost loved ones during the Holocaust will remain lost to history. But its poignancy at a site where death formed part of the very fabric of the landscape is evident. And it's notable that actually the book was opened to this morning liturgy in the archival collection. And some of the other objects that we have, aside from the paper ones in this collection, were mostly coins that the forensic investigators used to demonstrate the breadth of places from where the victims of Treblinka came. A police badge, which likely belonged to one of the Jewish policemen who were tasked with assisting the Nazis with rounding up Jews in the ghetto before they were often killed themselves. A cross reflecting the desire by the Polish authorities to illustrate the suffering of non-Jewish Poles, and a makeup compact representing women. Unfortunately, the aforementioned documents are the only objects in the group that can be directly connected to specific individuals. Another important source that I encountered during my research, which will lead me on to the next case study very shortly, were also recorded by the forensic investigators post-war, by the Soviets and Polish investigators. They interrogated many of the so-called Trawniki men. the auxiliary guards who were trained by the SS to assist them in the operation of the death camp and rounding up Jews in the ghetto. These interrogations were usually carried out as part of trials of the men in the Soviet Union, and they provided important descriptions of the camp landscape at Treblinka, including details that were not provided by the victims of the camp. Unlike the victims, who either did not survive or usually spent time in one or two areas, the Trawniki men often saw a greater extent of the camp landscape. They provided more spatial information, such as the image shown here, where one Trawniki man indicated all the guard positions that the Trawniki men rotated through, and these reflect the journey to the gas chambers and other killing sites taken by the different groups of victims. And so these are exceptionally useful when trying to understand the architecture and layout of the site. And these Trawniki men's testimonies illustrated the breadth of violence that was carried out at Treblinka across its entire landscape. And in summary, this included the fact that many more types of violence were carried out beyond the murders in the gas chambers at this site. The temporal scope of the violence was much greater than is generally described in historical texts. Attempts to hide the crimes were extensive, though not complete, but we also see further evidence of how the human body was desecrated after the deaths of the individuals at the camp. And individual SS guards and Trawniki men often had their own violent signatures and preferences that they enacted in the landscape. And just before I do move on to Trawniki, and I know we're probably running a little short of time, so I'll be brief, I just wanted to highlight one of the ways that I've tried to really share the archaeological findings with a wider audience. And so since 2014, I've worked with artists, particularly I've cooperated with an artist called Michael Savarich-Branthwaite to develop a number of exhibitions in which artists have responded to the archaeological findings at Treblinka, and as part of which we've used artistic practice to explore some of the lesser discussed issues relating to the camp's history and significance. Having developed an addition to the permanent exhibition that focused on the history and archaeology of the camp, and an accompanying art exhibition at the Treblinka Museum in 2015, we've also exhibited combined art and archaeology exhibition at the Wiener Library in London in 2016. And most recently, the reason I wanted to share this with you, we've used art as a way to explore the choices made by ordinary people during the Holocaust. This exhibition is called Supply Request, and Michael and I created this together as a joint artwork. And it was exhibited at the Stockport War Memorial Gallery last year, and it's our intention to share this at other venues in the future. And this exhibition essentially dissected one of the letters written by the first commandant of the extermination camp, Irmfried Erbel, in which he asked for supplies for the completion of the labour camp at Treblinka. But in fact, this letter was a request for materials to complete the extermination camp that was about to be opened. In the letter, he asked for railway spikes that would be used to complete the railway that would take victims to their deaths, pipes and materials for a motor that may have well been used in the killing apparatus, and perhaps most shocking, 120 rolls of wallpaper, the samples of which he asked should be provided first. And they were presumably going to be used to decorate the accommodation of the camp guards. And as an archaeological asset, of course, this letter is incredibly important. It reveals what I've termed in my book the spectre of objects. Those objects from Treblinka that we don't necessarily have physically, but which we have as a trace in the documentary record. And in the exhibition, we represent these items with modern surrogates, encouraging the viewer to think about how mundane items were used in acts of genocide, and how the men involved in carrying out genocidal acts approached the killings with an organisational and administrative logic, but also in a way that sought to deceive the victims, who, by the way, were forced to provide these very materials in the Warsaw Ghetto that would then be used to build the killing facility in which many of them would perish. And I'll just provide one example here. We also included some of the objects excavated by us at the extermination camp during our excavations, juxtaposed with witness testimonies that allude to the functions that these objects played in the killing process and in the lives of the victims to whom some of them belonged. So I'll just take 5 minutes, if I may, if that's okay, just to say something about Trawniki. And this is very much a new project. The work at Treblinka, I should say, has never ended. And although my work is complete on my book, even through the work we're doing at Trawniki, we continue to explore the connections between these two sites. All I would just really like to say is that Trawniki is a site that has been long forgotten. As I mentioned, it was the place where the auxiliary guards who helped in Treblinka were trained, but it was also a camp for Jews, a labor camp, a camp for Soviet prisoners of war, and it was a site where Jews were murdered en masse during Operation Harvest Festival, a killing action on November the 3rd, 1943, during which more Jews were killed in one day than at any other time since the Holocaust. Yet it is hardly ever known. And following the pilot project in October 2022, we launched the Trawniki Nexus of the Final Solution project, where we intend to use the same methods we used at Treblinka to create the first historical, spatial, and archaeological analysis of Trawniki, highlighting and better defining its function as a nexus of the final solution and its broader role in the persecution of the European Jewry. We also focus on the various roles that the Trawniki men had during the Holocaust as accomplices, perpetrators, witnesses, and casualties, and provide new insights into the architecture and operations of several camps in which the Trawniki men were held, thus providing unpublished information about the experiences of Jewish victims who lived and died there. And the outcome will be an innovative book which will allow readers to interact with historical and archaeological source material. And so these are just some images of Trawniki and the project. So I'm just going to just move through these next slides fairly quickly just to show you how Trawniki looked. It was built around a sugar factory, which then became the very epicenter of the multiple camps that I just mentioned. And I'm very pleased to say that there are memorials present in this landscape. And when we went there in April 2014, there is very much a local will to tell this history. We met many activists, local historians, and survivors and family members who wanted to share their stories. So I hope that this will be an extremely promising project that will result in many new and interesting findings. And if I may just show you very briefly as I bring to a close just some further images of the survey methods that we used. But I'm just going to skip ahead to this video, which shows you that Trawniki is a very different landscape to Treblinka. The traces here were not entirely destroyed. People now live in the buildings that were the former SS barracks, the barracks where Trawniki men were trained. They live and work in the landscapes that contain many, as we know, unmarked mass graves. And we now know that Trawniki was used as a killing site from 1939 until 1944. And so by mapping the contemporary landscape and understanding the landscape change that has happened, we hope that we're going to give a much more nuanced history of Trawniki, and one that recognizes its multiple phases of operation and its central and integral role to the Holocaust. And so what I'm showing you here is the first glimpse at the survey work that we undertook this year. So I'm going to leave that running and just say once again that I hope that this has given you an insight into the power of archaeology, of interdisciplinary approaches to tell the spatial and material histories of places like Treblinka and Trawniki, and how archaeology can fill some of the gaps that we may have as a result of the atrocious crimes that were committed during the Holocaust. I'd really like to dedicate my presentation today to the communities who have shared with me their stories, their pain in many cases. And I've been very fortunate as part of my work to take survivors and their families to visit Treblinka, to tell them about the findings that we have uncovered, and to share with them in really transformative experiences where they've made that very painful decision to travel to the sites where they lost so much themselves and where their family members perished. And so I would just like to dedicate, as I say, this talk to them, and also to the many victims who perished at sites like Treblinka and Trawniki who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
right. So thank you, Caroline, for such a powerful presentation. I have a whole list of questions from our book groups, and there's no way we're going to get through all of them. So I have the impossible task of picking just a couple, and we'll do our best with those. But we do have our reception afterwards. So if any of these questions that others have submitted don't get answered, please stick around and feel free to speak with our speakers some more. So one of the most common questions we got was about responses to your work and thinking about local communities, government officials, and perhaps maybe even others in the archaeological community, other researchers. But how would you describe what your work has represented to some of these different groups or how they've responded to what you've done?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think it really depends on the site itself. There's been a lot of variation. So, I mean, I'm very pleased to say that amongst victim communities and survivor communities that the work's been incredibly well received. And that's so important to my team and I that is the case. Because firstly, I think one of the main responses that we often get is that there is a sense of joy that someone wants to find the remains that exist, the physical evidence, and that people are still interested in this work. And I think many survivors have said that this kind of gives hope in an age when they might not be able to tell their own stories. And that's an incredibly powerful, sentiment that we hold really dear in the work that we do. Amongst, I'm still amazed by the responses that we also get from many rabbinical leaders and other religious authorities, by museum officials, that they trust us to do this kind of work, and that again is really important. But that is something that has to be earned, and there's a lot of work that goes into those dialogues and conversations about how to conduct our research, and we spend a lot of time speaking with those communities. But I can't say that that's always the case, and we have had quite a lot of opposition to the work that we do. We've had obviously deniers who have tried to claim that our work is not truthful, and that we're providing false evidence. We've had people who don't want to discuss the history for a whole host of different reasons because it's too difficult and too painful. And that's a landscape that we have to navigate with every project. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a concise but well articulated answer. So thank you. And I'm just going to ask the other question that was most common from our reading groups as well, which is really, as you think about the future of this field and the work that you're doing, what sorts of developments or applications are you most excited about, or kind of looking toward the future? What are you thinking about in terms of the work that you do?
I think a lot of the visualization possibilities, of course, in the era of digital advances in humanities, are really important because, as I mentioned, some of this data, I try to avoid today actually showing you some of the data that comes out of some of the machines that we use, because it is completely incomprehensible, to even to us sometimes. And so we need to find a way as researchers to obviously convey the importance of this material to a wider audience. So, I work a lot with games designers and people who are used to visualizing landscapes in different ways to try and find possibilities to create, like, as you saw there, amazing reconstructions. So this was, for example, comprised of tens of thousands of photographs that have been stitched together meticulously, and also laser scanning data that allows us to measure all those tiny points in a landscape to create a 3D model. And I think that brings it together in a way that can then not only be more understandable to the general public, but also offers possibilities to insert testimony and video material and all the content. And that's what we hope to do with the Trawniki project, by embedding and combining all of that material to really allow people not to just read one little quote, but to actually really experience the ability to see situated testimony in these digital landscapes. And I think that's a field that's really important and exciting, but it's also one, of course, that needs to be viewed with a lot of caution. And there's a lot of really important work being done now in digital Holocaust memory to make sure that, with advances in AI and virtual reality, that we also consider the ethical possibilities in those fields as well. But I think they have absolutely huge potential.
It's so exciting to think about where this might lead, and as you were saying, what this can mean for communities that have been affected in one way or another by this history. So we will pause here for our formal program for the night, and I want to thank all of you who have come to join us in person, all of you who are with us in our Zoom audience for the night, And also, just to remind you all that this is the first in the Cohen Institute's series on forensics and genocide of the year. So if you're interested in this topic, we have a whole slate of other amazing speakers who will be building off of what Caroline has shared with us tonight. But we invite you, if you're with us in person, to stay for our coffee reception until 7:45, so plenty of time to chat and mingle with others. But let's end with a final round of applause for our speaker. Thank you.